Evidence is out on the table that welfareism, inflationism, and socialism does not work. What we need is freedom in this country and a lot less government. And of course, the consequence of the foreign policy has been great. It has not been great because of all the cost, but all the enemies that are made. They talk about, well, is the Al-Qaeda gone? Will there be any more Al-Qaeda? And the real story is that there's a lot of people out there that still dislike us, and they're going to dislike all of us, because now we've taken it upon ourselves to say the global war on terrorism is global, and we have the authority and the responsibility to look at every square inch of this country in the world, and that we have the capability to hitting any postage stamp spot to kill those bad people. And guess what? We're doing it, and guess what? Sometimes we miss, sometimes the kids get killed, and sometimes innocent bystanders get killed. You don't build friendships that way, and believe me, we are more vulnerable, we are less secure because of that type of foreign policy than if we followed one of friendship and trade with countries. Yeah. China, that I believe that diplomatic thing will pass, and there will be not a major problem. I think it will not be a significant event, because there's a reason for that. Because we do, at least in spite of our shortcomings and China's shortcomings, there is a benefit to talking to China and trading with China. We get goods that are cheaper, and of course China likes to sell us goods, and even with all the shortcomings, this is the reason that we're not likely to have a war incident over this. 30, 40, 50 years ago, we'd have been probably on the verge of shooting and killing each other like we did when I was in high school during the Korean fiasco. But now, because we trade with people, they have second thoughts. This is why trading and friendship is so important. The founders talked about that and said that we should do that. But what do the enemies of our movement say? Oh, you're a bunch of isolationists and you don't want to deal with the world. I tell you, I think it's a lot better to deal with the world with friendship and trade than it is with bombs and intimidation. Unfortunately, we've only had two options on foreign policy. One option would be to go to a potential dictator and talk him into being our friendly dictator, and then we give him a lot of money. And then if we finally dislike that friendly dictator, or he turns on us, then we start bombing them. So I would say there should be a third option, you know, that option, at least talking to people. You know, the 60,000 diplomats that we have in the State Department, I think we ought to put them to work. Let them practice a little diplomacy once in a while.
I agree. Oh, yeah.
But unfortunately, those in charge right now are much more enthusiastic about the intimidation. But the other side that accuses us of isolationism are the very first ones to want to put on sanctions on country, to say that we're going to put sanctions on and punish the leaders like we have been doing for 50 years with Castro. But guess what? The people suffer. It never punishes the leaders. The leaders use us as a scapegoat and say they suffer not because of communism or their system, but because of Americans being involved. So it doesn't work. Matter of fact, the sanctions on Iran actually backfire on us, because the dissidents that would like to change their government then all have to get together for nationalistic reasons to come together and stand behind their government. So I think sanctions are wrong, and sanctions are just an act of war. And it's time to get rid of all the sanctions on Cuba. Let's get the Cold War over with for good. The Soviet system, when I was in the Air Force in the 60s, there was a pretty serious Cold War going on. There were missiles in Cuba, and we had to be alert. The world is quite different now, but the whole effort that is being made by us, I think, is overdone. I think we just do way too much at the wrong time and spend too much money, and we make too many enemies. So what we need to do, obviously, is change this foreign policy. And the foreign policy is one that's been around a long time. It was actually started by Woodrow Wilson and at the turn of the last century. And this whole notion that we can make the world safe for democracy, and now it's been translated into this neoconservatism where they feel morally obligated that we must use force to spread our goodness because we are an exceptional nation. If we are an exceptional nation and set a good standard, yes, then maybe they'll emulate us, but we're not very exceptional if we think that we can intimidate people and believe in preemptive war and starting wars that we can't even finish. But we have a long way to go because, unfortunately, the leadership in both parties are very much in agreement with much of the problems that we have today. If you look at the foreign policy, does it ever change? I mean, we elect a Democrat. We hope the Democrat will be less warmongering. And of course, there was some encouragement. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for peace, so what the heck? We're on our way. So then the next day, he expands the war and invades another country. So it doesn't work, and of course, and when we get the Republicans in charge, the Republicans are the fiscal conservatives, and just look at what's happened when we had the House and the Senate and the presidency. The Department of Education doubled in size. The prescription drug program started satisfying the drug companies and the big businesses. That gets passed and added on. So, and the deficits explode. So what we need is a constitutional president that will not yield to those temptations.
President Paul! President Paul! President Paul! President Paul! Woo!
So we have
Hell yeah.
we know what the problems are, we know what the solutions are, but the political drama is still there. We have an election coming up, we know what has to be done. We don't know what the results will be in California. I do want to report to you, though, that we have spent a fair amount of time in California. We've spent 2 weeks here, and the campuses have been very welcome and open to our ideas. For a surprise on election day, to the point where maybe the Main Street media will have to cover what we're doing. But we don't know exactly what will happen on that election, or what will happen in August in Tampa, or what will happen in November. But I can tell you that we are winning a tremendous battle, and that is that we are winning the battle for the hearts and minds of the American people who are sick and tired of what they're getting out of Washington, D.C. And when I think about winning or losing the individual battles and what we strive for to win the ultimate battle, I think of a conversation between two colonels after the Vietnam War. Colonel 2 from Vietnam was talking to Colonel Harry Summers. It was shortly after the fighting stopped, and they were going back and forth on the details of ending the war. And Summers wanted to get the last word in, and he looked at Colonel 2 and said, "You do know that you never defeated us once on the battlefield." And 2 said, "Colonel, you're exactly right, but it's irrelevant." It's irrelevant because they won the war, because they were representing the hearts and minds of people who thought the French and the Americans didn't have a right to be in their country, trying to settle a civil war. So when you're fighting for your country, it's a lot different, and you do end up ultimately very often winning. And just think of how many years, decades, hundreds of years, or centuries that the people of Afghanistan said, we want to run our own life, we have enough problems, we'll take care of them, but we don't want the Soviets in here, and we don't want the Americans in this country, we want you out of here now. It's always much easier if you're defending a homeland to ultimately win the battle, but when the military has tremendous force, you can lose a lot of battles, but you eventually will lose the war. But the Soviet system was doomed to fail. It was predicted by Austrian economists as far back as 1912 by Mises that socialism can't work because you lose your pricing structure. Without the pricing structure, you don't know what supply and demands are. You get malinvestment, you get too much debt, and all these problems of inflation. So, but he said that it would fail, and it did. So, as terrible as the Cold was with the confrontation of thousands of missiles, the Soviets had 30,000 and we had nearly as many as well, and it was very, very dangerous. But we didn't have to fight it with a nuclear exchange. Here today we are intimidated by a third world country that has no army of sorts and no navy, no air force, no intercontinental ballistic missiles, no nuclear weapons, and we were ready to go to war because someday, someplace they might get a nuclear weapon, and yet we stood the Soviets down. I would say that we shouldn't be so easily intimidated.
Come on, Rob!
Now the Soviets were defeated for a very precise reason, for economic reasons. They overextended themselves, which empires almost inevitably do. They overextend themselves, they spend themselves into bankruptcy, and their economic system collapses. Now, bin Laden had a precise plan to get us more involved in the Middle East by sending individuals over here to cause harm, because he thought that we might then take the bait and go over there and occupy at least one Muslim country. Of course, how many countries are we in now? We can't even count them. There's so many. His plan was to get us involved in one country and get us bogged down in the war over there. His other plan was to cause dissent in this country. He was, I'm sure, thinking about the dissent of the 1960s of the Vietnam War. But the other plan that he had was to bankrupt our country by overextending ourselves overseas. And here we have done exactly what he was looking for us to do, and we have sacrificed another 8,500 Americans, 40,000 Americans severely wounded, hundreds of thousands begging and pleading for help at the Veterans Administration. We have an epidemic of suicides with our military, more people dying from suicide than we do from combat. So we're not winning this war because we're not willing to take and look at what the CIA has told us and taught us. They said, be careful what we do. Not only are there unintended consequences with our foreign policy, but watch out, there will be blowback and we will suffer the consequences. This is the reason why we have to come to our senses and change our foreign policy to national defense and not world domination. The intellectual revolution is well in place. There was an intellectual revolution prior to our first revolution that lasted probably 100 years. And the founders were well versed in history. They knew about the Magna Carta. They knew about Old Testament history. They knew the dangers of kings. So they were well versed about property rights. And finally there was a political action, which was the revolution and the writing of the Constitution. Well, today the intellectual revolution is much more successful than what we see in Washington. This has been going on for 30 or 40 years. It's been quiescent, but it has been now bearing fruit today with this generation, because it is this generation that has required that we bring forth in a presidential election for the first time since the Fed was started, that the Federal Reserve is an issue in this presidential election.